Hi folks, I'm Spence, and on today's episode of Cult Mania we are going to be looking at the new second sight release of George Romero's Martin. This has been a long time coming.
Martin. Terror.
So, for those of you who don't know, Martin was George Romero's vampire film. It came out just before Dawn of the Dead, following on from The Crazies. So it's still in that very low budget era of George Romero, and we've been waiting for a nice release of it for quite a long time, and this second sight release that I am holding here has been a long time coming, delayed multiple times as they tried to get hold of the longer cut, which I will bring up in a little bit. But it is here. This is the 4K version with a book and all the fancy shite, so I will go into that as well. The plot of Martin is not your stereotypical 1970s vampire film. This is not high gothic castles and seductive vampires in fabulous long cloaks. This is about Martin, a young boy, well, sort of late teen, early 20s looking boy, who believes he's a vampire and whose family believe he's a vampire and send him to be looked after by his super religious elderly cousin who hates him and frequently just shouts Nosferatu at him and basically appears like he's going to kill him at any moment. You know, he's got garlic hanging on every door and crosses and all that stuff. Which notably has zero effect on Martin, who has none of the vampiric powers one would expect. He literally just wants to drink blood, that is it. He is not super strong, can't talk to animals, can't turn into a bat, can't, mesmerise people. It's just a dude that wants blood, who is very lonely and has this very naive, very childlike view of the world, potentially can be read as being autistic, and the main crux of the film really is, are we looking at someone who is a vampire, or are we looking at someone who's been manipulated into believing that they are a vampire?
My name is Martin. I'm 84 years old. People think I'm crazy when I tell them how old I am. I'd like to be normal. I just have a sickness. The only way I can survive is by drinking blood.
A huge part of why the film works in this, is he a vampire, isn't he a vampire, comes down to John Amplas playing Martin and the performance that he gives. Martin, as portrayed here, is very, very reclusive, very socially awkward, very naive and childlike. He speaks very little. He often stands sort of hunched over, looking down. The camera often looks down on him, and he looks very young, which there's camera tricks that make him look that way, and has this long hair. There's a very effeminate nature to him, which I think again plays into when you contrast him with his cousin, who's this very strong, older, largely built man with this beard, and you have this very big contrast in both how they look and in the way they speak. He's so meek and quiet. A huge part of the plot has to do with his sexual drives towards the women whose blood he takes, and wanting to have sex but not feeling confident enough to do it when they're awake, which I will come to. And that makes... He's at once both incredibly pathetic, especially when you are sort of contrasting what a vampire should be. Your Christopher Lees, these sort of, and Bela Lugosi's, these very sexual, very commanding presences who, despite their sinister nature, are incredibly upfront and obvious, whereas Martin is just receding into the background of shots and just standing awkwardly in the corner. It is not the most nuanced of performances, and I think there are ways in which you can read the is Martin autistic or on the spectrum somewhere can feel a little bit ham-fisted. They can feel sort of so obvious and so obviously awkward. But I think by comparison to every performance in this is heightened to some degree. There is an element of gothic melodrama to the film, despite the fact that it's set in modern day and is this very low budget, very scrawny production. As I said, the cousin, played by Lincoln Mazel, frequently just goes, Nosferatu! It happens so often, it is slightly hilarious. And yet it does also play into, like I said, you get this very big contrast between the meek and the intense. And a lot of the performances have that low-budget horror movie from the 70s feel of being ever so slightly overacted. But it does create that nice contrast with Martin. He feels out of place in the world. And whilst you are not going to treat the film as having these great realistic performances, they still work.
I have to be careful all the time. But I'm pretty good at it. I think as I get older, I get better. I haven't been caught yet.
The look of the film is very, very rough and ready. This release restores it to being 4:3, which is clearly what it was shot at. It's very grainy film stock, very high contrast. There are many, many dark sequences and scenes in which you are mainly looking at shadow, and it almost has a monochromatic feel to it. Romero wanted to film the entire film in black and white, but the studio, well, the financiers, let's go for rather than studio, wouldn't let him. They saw it as being too much of a risk. So instead, the colour images are pushed to this very monochromatic contrast. And there are sequences in black and white in which we explore Martin's memories. Whether they are memories or whether they are figments of his imagination is left, again, up to the audience to decide. Those look incredible. They are fabulous. Despite, again, the fact that you can tell they were made on no money, they have a heightened quality to them. I do wish the entire film had been perhaps made in black and white. But that is not to knock the colour stuff. The film stock chosen or how it's been treated highlights red very much. Regardless of where... Some of the shadows have a very red hue, which I'm guessing comes from the film stock. And in some ways, it affects like Martin's complexion. He can look quite red, and I think that really heightens the childlike nature of his face. He looks like someone somewhat going through puberty in that he's very flushed, almost sort of acne-ish. I think that works really well. I think it is worth noting this was a cheap film. The film was in part made to raise money to try and help George Romero get out of debt, from what I can read. It didn't. Dawn of the Dead was the film that actually, took off. This was not particularly well received. So despite this being a fabulous 4K restoration, that they definitely, they have done wonders. This is a massive, massive, massive step up from the Arrow release that we had in the UK years and years ago, which I quickly popped in to have a look at this morning. This is, leaps and bounds above. It still looks rough. This does not appear to have been restored from like an original camera negative. I think these are, this is a print rather than the original. Reel 2 or 3 is a notable step down in quality. The colour work seems much more sort of overly saturated and strange. But I do find this era of low budget filmmaking has so much charm. I would much rather look at a slightly crappy print of something like Martin than a crappy digital film, because it still has texture. And that is a huge part. Second Sight have been great at doing this. They leave the texture of the film completely intact, which I know will be a huge bone of contention for some people on the internet. There's a lot of grain here.
See, people don't understand what's wrong. They think that I'm a monster. They think I'm a vampire.
I don't normally talk about editing, but it feels very worth talking about here. The editing for Martin is very obvious, or at least I found it to be. It's quite jarring, especially the first opening sequence, which is set aboard a train. And I'm not just talking about the massive continuity issue that does pop up in the first scene. Anyway, it's got a very sort of French New Wave feel to the editing. You are often cutting between these sort of establishing wide shots, these very, 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 very close up shots of like syringes or other. It's film that sort of lurches you back and forwards quite a lot. But it works, and it also feels worth noting. Some of the tension sequences, or action sequences, for lack of a better word. I mean, there is a literal action sequence which comes out of nowhere. Oh, so well orchestrated, and that comes down to, Romero's planning, clearly. And I think his history as an editor, the film is edited fantastically. The mood and tension and the speed of some of the editing in, say, like there's a home invasion sequence, which is masterfully edited. I know there's often the thing that people say that if you notice editing is wrong. But it was one of those things that I was just watching it like, Jesus, this is perfectly paced, perfectly timed. That cut goes perfectly there. It is really, really something to behold.
People don't realize that those things I see in the movies are not real. I don't have a whole lot of women.
What is perhaps something not to be behold is the soundtrack, which is all over the place. I feel like this is a very similar job to what Romero did with Dawn of the Dead, where we have a mix of score being inserted and library tracks, because we oscillate quite rapidly between these very, very squelchy synths, which I quite enjoyed. They feel like they're just verging on being out of tune, and these sort of more classical pieces that sometimes feel like they were meant for something else, which I think are to bring in that gothic nature, but sometimes feel really out of place. Which makes it even stranger that the soundtrack has been included on CD in this new release. because it is odd. The violence in Martin is not going to blow anyone away in terms of its effects. Despite the fact that there were things that the MPAA did not like and had shortened and cut, the blood here is very, very fake looking. It is Tom Savini, but it's, if you know what the blood looks like in Dawn of the Dead, it's very similar. It's the red paint style. It comes down to a lot more. Some of these sequences are so horrific because there's a reality to them outside of the effects. Martin doesn't have fangs, despite a sequence where he dresses up as a stereotypical vampire, which again highlights that childish nature that he has. So he uses razor blades to slice the women's wrists to drink from. And there is something very horrific about it because, obviously it brings up images of suicide, and it also, tying in with Martin's sort of impotent nature and the sexuality that comes with all vampire stories. Again, I think there's a very interesting shot in the very first sequence in which Martin slices his victim's wrist and the blood sort of spurts all over his face, drips onto him. He strips off whenever he does this, so it's clearly got, although there's a practical, I don't want to get my clothes covered in blood, it adds this sexual nature, but he becomes much more vulnerable, and whether you want to treat it as an effeminate thing or as a somewhat homosexual styling, the way that the blood splatters onto him has a very orgasmic nature. It feels again, I think it's combining the film with that hot, gritty, grimy stock footage that sort of brings about images that these films were made alongside porn films. It has this very sort of pornographic money shot quality to it, especially because you can tell that there's this sort of pleasured aspect to Amblas's performance. I was really struck by that. I think also the fact that Martin drugs all of his victims, which also is possibly the most realistic drugging of people I can remember, obviously has this very sexual violence, rape aspect. A lot of the women assume that is what's happening. We don't see that happen, but it's also indicated that he could be he's almost certainly sexually assaulting people while they're asleep. So you get lots of shots of syringes, and that's almost where the fear a lot of the women have comes from. It's the fear that they're going to be assaulted sexually. They don't understand. He doesn't explain that he's going to drink the blood or anything, because they are awake for 5 minutes. These scenes go on and on. He has to drug people because even in a vaguely drugged state, they can fight back against him. He is weak. He is pathetic. And I think it is the fact that actually watching people slowly succumb to being drugged, whereas in a lot of films, if someone is sedated, it's and then they slowly slump and that's it. It's very protracted and very realistic in that regard, which makes it far more uncomfortable than any other time that I can think that I've seen something like that, especially for a film of that is this old.
I follow them. I plan. I'm very careful. I have needles now. I can use them. I can put them to sleep. And it doesn't hurt.
I think George Romero is often remembered for his ideas, and that is a huge part of why Romero's films are interesting, because they are politically and conceptually so interesting. And I think almost sometimes it's used as a way to diminish his filmmaking ability, especially when it comes to like the later of the Dead stuff, and just going, oh well, it was a sci-fi zombie film, it was a found footage zombie film, it was a weird western cowboy zombie film. And yeah, this is the weird vampire film about the kid who's not sure if he's a vampire. But A, that's a fucking good idea. And B, this is such a well... There are elements of Martin that are not brilliant. There are shots that are a bit ropey. There are performances that are very ropey. But underneath it all is this incredibly well-paced, well-constructed movie. The film barrels along mainly because it's an edited down version. The reason this release took so long to come out is because they were attempting to get hold of the newly discovered 2.5 hour edit of Martin, which I wish they had, and fuck knows what's going on that we have discovered this amazing version of it that has been long thought lost, and yet no one can fucking see it. But I am still very glad that this film has been given a great treatment. I'm rambling because I've gone completely off topic. Martin is so well constructed, despite the fact that it is this edited down version. The sequences, the home invasion, the opening on the train, so many other bits of it are just... They highlight so well why Romero was a genius. And that underneath all the concepts and all the ideas, there is brilliant filmmaking going on. And I think being that more stripped down, lower budget, almost feeling like it was just guerrilla shot film, highlights all of that technical brilliance so well. And we've now got it in the best version of the original theatrical edit that we can have. I mean, we've got... So I bought the 4K version, so I've got it on 4K, you get it on Blu-ray, and you get a CD with the soundtrack, that weird soundtrack. You also get a fuck ton of art cards. Yay! Which actually are nice. Second Sight are becoming the best. I think they are the best boutique label at the moment. They've massively outdone Arrow. I am quite disappointed with a lot of what Arrow have been putting out recently. And you get a book, and I know not everyone loves a book, but I mean, Jesus Christ, look how thick it is. And it's got essays from everyone that you could want. There are so many names that you will go, they're brilliant. I'd love to write an essay for something like this one day. Who knows, maybe I will. Anyway. It's one of those things that I think Martin will always be overshadowed by both the zombie films of Romero and the Crazies. I think, because the Crazies is in there with the zombie stuff. But it's such a unique little film, and I say a little film because it does feel like a little film. It somehow feels smaller than Night of the Living Dead. And yet that, I mean that as a compliment, and I hope we do get a release at some point with the long cut. Because from what I understand, that was the cut that Romero wanted out in the world. And again, I'm very confused as to why it's being hidden away, especially when the Romero estate are doing so much to have other stuff released. But if you have not seen Martin, I would highly recommend getting hold of it. And if you have seen Martin, and on DVD notably, get the new version. You are missing out on quite a lot by having the old DVD. And also, it's got 4 fucking commentary tracks. I held that up, that's just a picture. It's got 4 commentary tracks, 2 with George and Tom Savini, so get on it. But let me know down in the comments what you think of Martin. Where does it rank in all of the George Romero films that you've seen, or in vampire films? Also, is he a vampire? Let me know down in the comments, like and subscribe so you don't miss any more videos, and I shall see you next time. Fuck you, whatever you are, noisy bastards.